Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Gut Reset Summit. I'm your host, Dr. John Dempster, and today I am joined with an amazing colleague and friend, Dr. Rodger Murphree, and we are here to discuss some very important topics on IBS and the fibromyalgia connection. Now, Dr. Murphree is a chiropractic physician, a board-certified nutritional specialist, and an internationally recognized fibromyalgia expert. His books are on my wall back there somewhere. His Murphree method, a combination of functional and orthomolecular medicine, has helped thousands of patients to get well and healthy and feel good again. He is the author of Treating and Beating Fibromyalgia and the Chronic Fatigue Syndrome, Treating and Beating Anxiety and Depression with Orthomolecular Medicine, and Heart Disease, What Your Doctor Won't Tell You. Dr. Murphree maintains a very busy telemedicine practice, and he is a frequent guest on local and national radio and television networks, and he writes for several professional and public health-related publications. Dr. Rodger, great to see you again. I'm looking forward
Hey, thanks, Dr. Dempster. John, it's always a delight to get to spend some time with you and just have a dialogue about the topics that we entertain together. They're some of the most wonderful conversations I have, and so I'm really looking forward to this interview.
Yeah, likewise. I guess I have a burning question. You and I have talked about fibromyalgia before, but first of all, what is it? We're going to get into that, but we're going to draw an interesting connection to that and IBS, which is a significant issue with a lot of people with gut issues. So let's start with the obvious question. What is fibromyalgia? We hear so much about this. Break it down for us.
Well, so fibromyalgia is a name given to describe a group of symptoms that people have in common. This is what we do for a syndrome. So irritable bowel syndrome is, bloating, gas, loose bowel movements, constipation. Fibromyalgia syndrome, the common symptoms are diffuse, achy, sometimes disabling pain, fatigue, insomnia, brain fog. And what we're going to talk about today, irritable bowel syndrome. So fibromyalgia affects primarily women. About 95% of people have fibromyalgia are women between the age of 30 and 66. It affects, estimates are about 6 to 8% of the worldwide population. I feel like that number is probably pretty conservative. And I think what we're seeing post-COVID now, we're seeing that a lot of people are now starting to develop this thing called fibromyalgia, getting that diagnosis as well. So I think those numbers are growing, unfortunately, instead of shrinking.
So here's an interesting, we're going to get into a lot about it. I guess one of the questions is, as a syndrome, it's not a disease where you have this pathognomonic test where you can actually test for it and measure it. How does somebody get diagnosed with fibro?
So usually, John, it's a process of elimination. Like a lot of chronic illnesses, you go to your doctor. Sometimes it takes, half a dozen doctors and half a dozen years before you ever get the diagnosis of fibromyalgia. But it's a process of elimination. So you go to your doctor and he or she runs tests and they're not really sure what's going on. So maybe they refer you to a rheumatologist. He or she runs tests. Those come back usually normal. But once autoimmune diseases like MS and Sjogren's and Reiter's and rheumatoid arthritis are ruled out, then usually you get the diagnosis of fibromyalgia. There's some real telltale signs that if you have these things, you probably have fibromyalgia or you're heading that way. And so poor sleep. If you have diffuse all over pain that's getting worse, not getting better, that's been ongoing for at least 6 months, and you're struggling to get a good night's sleep, you're heading towards fibromyalgia. That's really kind of a simple way to look at it. But really that is what really kind of brings it on is poor sleep. That really is one of the big triggers of fibromyalgia. And we'll link that to irritable bowel here in just a minute. But for those of you that have heard the term, not really sure, heard us mention about diffuse achy pain, and that combined with chronic poor sleep, you're probably at risk of developing fibromyalgia.
And how long would that is a massive trigger. And there's so many people suffering from sleep issues. Of course, that's a whole nother summit on its own. But, how long would that manifest if somebody's got sleep issues? Typically, I'm sure there's a lot of varying variables there, but do you see a pattern in terms of timeline?
Well, so the causes of fibromyalgia are debated. And I've been specializing in this for 20 years, and I don't think we're any closer to saying there is one smoking gun. As you said, there's no one pathology with a syndrome. But what we see is a common trigger is stress. And that stress could be chronic stress, or it could be an acute stressor. It could be death of a loved one. It could be surgery, post-surgical. It could be some type of accident. But there's a straw that breaks the camel's back for these individuals, and they start to develop these symptoms associated with fibromyalgia. Maybe initially, it's some achy all over pain, some fatigue. But once chronic poor sleep enters into the equation, that's the slippery slope that really gets everybody. And no matter whether they're prescribed sleep aids, prescription sleep medications or not, once we start seeing poor sleep and low serotonin, which goes hand in hand, now we start to see this chronic thing called fibromyalgia show up.
So I'm curious to know, how does IBS connect with fibromyalgia? I know you and I have talked a lot about this, but let's break it down for everyone who's tuning in on this chat today. What if they've got IBS? Does that mean they're getting fibromyalgia, vice versa? Like, what's the connection?
So 70% of those with fibromyalgia have irritable bowel syndrome. And the common denominators are, number one, we see that individuals with irritable bowel syndrome are more likely, like those with fibromyalgia, to have some type of traumatic or stressful childhood. They lose their plasticity, their ability to rebound to stress. Maybe as an adolescent or a young child, they were in a toxic household. Maybe there was abuse, or it could be that they had an illness like mono that really was incredibly stressful, or they moved around a lot. Maybe they were in a military family, but they get under a lot of stress as a child, and then as they start to try to navigate adulthood, something comes along. Again, that's the straw that breaks the camel's back, and they can't recover. It puts them over the edge. So that's a common denominator we see. Stress. We know that individuals with irritable bowel syndrome, they tend to have flares when they get under stress, and that could be real or it can be imagined. It doesn't have to be. It could be, just a worry wart. You're still releasing these chemicals that can sabotage the gut-brain axis. This bidirectional communication that's going on between the two. We know that when you get under stress, you start to sabotage your secretory IgA levels, which are the sentry guards to your gut that help to sound the alarm bells and initiate immune reaction when needed to destroy any kind of foreign invaders. Stress, one burst of anger, I saw this not too long ago. One burst of anger can reduce secretory IgA levels in the gut by 50% for up to 4 hours. So you can see that stress can be a catalyst that really can set up this irritable bowel, as well as fibromyalgia. The other common denominator is low serotonin. So serotonin is a neurotransmitter. It's a hormone that you have in the brain. You also have it in the gut. In fact, as you know this, you have more serotonin receptors in your intestinal tract than you do in your brain. So when you get nervous, you get butterflies in your stomach. But for those with fibromyalgia, they are low in serotonin, and because of that, they develop a thing called allodynia, which is low pain threshold. So pain becomes more magnified. As this brain chemical serotonin goes up, what we see is your pain threshold goes up, so pain goes down. But what we see with irritable bowel and fibromyalgia, with the slow serotonin state, we see that as that serotonin is deficient, then the pain threshold goes down, pain's more magnified. Mm-hmm. And both those with fibro and with irritable bowel have a thing called central sensitization pain syndrome, where the pain messages are magnified. That this brain gut bidirectional communication was sending these messages. What we see is oftentimes in irritable bowel and fibromyalgia, that pain message does not turn off, and it's magnified by some 30%. So they're really, we see that these individuals are at they're at a disadvantage, because if they've got any kind of bug or any kind of malabsorption or leaky gut or yeast overgrowth or bad bacteria that's initiating some bloating and gas and indigestion, that pain from that is magnified tremendously more than it would be in someone who doesn't have central sensitization pain syndrome.
So it sounds to me like a big part of your focus, and we'll get into your methodology here, but a big part of your focus with treating fibro is to make sure that the gut is working well. And often while you do that, you come across, a lot of these connections to a lot of these issues, whether it's IBS been formally diagnosed or somebody who has a parasite or a yeast overgrowth or any other sort of infections. You're seeing that a lot. Is that correct?
So again, 70% of people with fibro have irritable bowel syndrome. So that's my practice primarily. So I see that, for sure, 70%, that's about right in my practice. But fortunately, John, the way that I treat fibromyalgia patients, what I've learned over the last 20 years, those protocols really can dramatically reduce or eliminate irritable bowel within a short period of time, 2 to 4 weeks, just by getting some key parts of the puzzle right. Obviously, if you're having gut issues, you're going to have all sorts of different health issues can show up because of the whole problem with leaky gut and food allergies and SIBO and all the people, you've had some great interviews on here. I know that people talk about parasites and leaky gut and food allergies and small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And oftentimes people really focus on that as the trigger for their irritable bowel. And certainly can play a role, and it can be the main trigger. But what I find is there's some things that you can do before you go off the deep end and go on an anti-lectin diet, or you go on the SIBO diet, the elemental diet, which is, that's a brutal diet. There's some things you can do, some steps you can take that oftentimes, at least for my patients, that can dramatically reduce the symptoms or eliminate the symptoms of irritable bowel.
Rodger, I'm all ears. Let's talk about the 5 steps, big guy.
So in functional medicine, the way that you and I practice, the way that we're trained, one of the big things we talk about, you're only as healthy as your gut. Because anytime you're putting something in your mouth that goes in the gut, it can be a foreign invader. There can be toxins in there. There can be bad bacteria. There can be yeast. Or your body can be triggered to release inflammatory chemicals, thinking that this food stuff is actually something bad, when actually it's just a food reaction or a mast cell reaction or histamine reaction. I think the place to start is to make sure that when you're eating your food, that it's being digested, it's being broken down and digested. And for a lot of people, by the time they get in their 40s, when they eat food, instead of releasing digestive enzymes or having the stomach acid that they need to break that food down, they've depleted that after years of stress and poor dietary habits. So that food just sits there in the stomach. And now you run the risk of that triggers bloating and gas and putrefaction. You get all these toxins that are sitting there, and you become constipated because it's just sitting there. And that sets up what we see with irritable bowel C, irritable bowel constipation, or even irritable bowel A, where you go back and forth between constipation, loose bowel movement, because one day it's sitting there constipated, then you get under some stress, and next thing you know, you have dumping syndrome, where now you just have to make it to the bathroom as quick as you can. You have loose bowel movements all day, or you eat a greasy meal or something that is a trigger for you. Sometimes it's fat, for most people it's the grease, or other people it can be spicy, or for some people it can be sugar. But the first place you want to start to repair irritable bowel is not only cleaning up your diet, which I recommend, with plenty of fiber, plant-based diet, a little bit of protein, but taking a digestive enzyme. It's inexpensive. It's something that a lot of times by doing that, you'll see that the bloating and the gas and the indigestion goes away. Then the next step, and there's all kind of different digestive enzymes. We can go into more detail if you want to. I like just simple pancreatic digestive enzymes because it's simple.
Mm-hmm.
The next step is making sure you have the nutrients that your body needs to be able to break down this food and to absorb it. And one of the main ones I see deficient in my patients, and really most everybody really, I think, is magnesium. The magnesium is a natural muscle relaxer for fibromyalgia. It relaxes those tight, achy muscles, but it also is helps to relax tight colon. So if you've got constipation, if you're not taking magnesium, or maybe you're not taking enough, but oftentimes that magnesium deficiency is going to show up as constipation, or it can show up as restless leg syndrome, or eye twitches, or cramps. These are some things that we can see that they're showing you that you're probably low in magnesium. And once you start supplementing with a good multivitamin, and I recommend an optimal daily allowance multivitamin that has not the RDA, not based on the RDA, which would be like a Centrum Silver or one a day, which has, just enough nutrients in there to keep you from getting scurvy or berry. But it's really not going to do much to really help you be healthy. So an optimal daily multivitamin like what you carry in your dispensary or what I carry is going to be 500 to 1,000 times stronger than the RDA. Safe, but effective. And so typically people need about 400 to 600 milligrams of magnesium, preferably magnesium citrate, chelate, glycinate, to allow them to have normal bowel movements every day. Some people, though, as you know, John, they may need 1,000 milligrams of magnesium before they start having a normal bowel movement. So it's really a little bit of trial and error. Start taking that magnesium and keep increasing by 150 to 200 milligrams every day until you have a normal bowel movement. If you get a loose bowel movement, then just reduce your dose. Now, some of you might start taking a multivitamin and all of a sudden have a loose bowel movement, which in the beginning, you go, wow, that's great. I hadn't had a bowel movement every day in years, but I don't want it to be loose every day. And so one thing to be on the lookout for is if you start a multivitamin and you start getting loose bowel movements, look to see, are you taking any additional magnesium in another formula, hair, skin, and nail formula, a bone formula, whatever it is. Don't just stop the multivitamin, reduce your magnesium intake. But I think you need a good multivitamin to shore up any kind of nutritional deficiency. I think it's very important. Then the other thing is serotonin. We mentioned earlier, I was talking about the importance of serotonin. You have more serotonin receptors in your intestinal tract than you do in your brain. And that serotonin helps control the motility, so how fast or how slow food moves through your intestinal tract. And when you get low in serotonin, not only do you run the risk of getting depressed and maybe feeling anxious and having problems with sleep and more pain than you should, the same things we would see with fibromyalgia, but you see that you start to have problems oftentimes with loose bowel movements, to where every time you eat, that your body's trying to get that food stuff out as quickly as it can. And so by adding 5-HTP, 5-hydroxytryptophan, combined with a good multivitamin, that 5-HTP, which is an over-the-counter supplement, that turns into serotonin. That's where it comes from. And you can try to get it in your diet when you eat protein foods, but a lot of times you can't get enough. But you can supplement with 100 milligrams of 5-HTP 3 times a day. So with each meal, and what you should see, that starts to make serotonin. And now you'll see that those loose bowel movements, typically that's what improves those loose bowel movements, they go away. If you still are having loose bowel movements after the fact that you're using a digestive enzyme, taking enough magnesium and a good multivitamin and the 5-HTP, then I would encourage you, first of all, to increase the 5-HTP up to 500 milligrams. If you continue to have the loose bowel movement, then I would add something like S-Boulardi, which S-Boulardi is an over-the-counter prebiotic, so it helps to grow the good bacteria, and it's typically recommended for traveler's diarrhea. But S-Boulardi will crowd down any potential pathogens or yeast or bad bacteria and start to grow the good bacteria. And typically, by doing that, you'll see that those loose bowel movements will turn around and will improve. Now, once you do those things, then you start looking at, if you continue to have problems, then you start looking at elimination diets and food allergy testing and maybe SIBO, depending on what the symptoms are. But what I've found, John, is just these simple first steps oftentimes is enough to stop irritable bowel symptoms in my patients.
Yeah, and those are awesome. Thanks for presenting those. Those are 5 very powerful tools to leverage right away. And you really piqued my interest when you started talking about magnesium. Right now, I think some of the researchers claim it's got up to 600 jobs per second in our body. So it is a very common deficiency that we see. And yes, you can measure this, or like Dr. Rodger said, you can also just try and a little trial and error. It's a very safe mineral, and it's something that you'll get, relatively instant feedback if you're getting the right types of doses. Now, the other question that you piqued my thoughts on was, a lot of times we have patients that come in that we have this conversation about serotonin. They're like, well, that's great. Yeah, my doctor wants to prescribe an antidepressant. Now, do you find that those have the same effect as using things like 5-HTP that are going to naturally build up your serotonin levels versus an antidepressant that's more likely to keep those existing levels in circulation?
Well, so there's a direct correlation between low serotonin and irritable bowel, as we've established. And a lot of times, individuals with irritable bowel, their doctors will prescribe an antidepressant. We also see you're more likely to have irritable bowel if you're depressed. And we see that in fibromyalgia. There's unfortunately those with fibromyalgia oftentimes are not understood. Their doctors don't know how to treat them. They're kind of just left with the idea of learn to live with it.
Mm-hmm.
And that brings on depression along with the low serotonin that they and those with irritable bowel have. But no one has an antidepressant deficiency. So no one has a Prozac deficiency or Celexa deficiency. I'm not saying there's not a time and a place for those medications, but those medications don't make serotonin. They only help you hang on to what you have. And if you're run down from years of stress, or you got under a lot of stress and you've depleted your stress coping chemicals, including serotonin, if you're taking a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor and there's nothing to reuptake, it's really not going to do anything. It's like using a gasoline additive in an empty gasoline tank. If you're running on fumes and you pour some STP gasoline additive in there to get some more mileage, it isn't going to do much. We also need to be aware that the meta-analysis of antidepressants show that 70% of the time, an antidepressant is no better than a sugar pill, no better than a placebo. Again, I'm not telling you to stop your medication. I'm not saying that, but just be aware that antidepressants, some of their potential side effects, ironically, are anxiety and depression and gut issues. They can cause weight gain. They can cause diffuse achy pain. Depending on what antidepressant you're taking, can cause weight gain, can cause problems with mental clarity issues, brain fog. So yes, there's a time and a place for those medications, but ideally you would look to taking something that's over the counter like 5-HTP, which when it's combined with the synergistic vitamins and minerals, magnesium, the B vitamins and vitamin C, that turns into serotonin. That's where it comes from. And it's much safer going that route than using a prescription antidepressant.
Yeah, 100% agree. And, the other thing is any of the supplements you've been discussing today, these are things that you can stop on a dime virtually if you need to. Some medications, as many people who have been on antidepressants, you don't stop those on a dime. You work with your doctor and you wean off it over time. So what Dr. Rodger's saying is like, look, try these things first. And if you find that they're helpful, wonderful. You might not even need to be on them forever and ever. But I would 100% agree with you, Rodger, let's always begin on the least invasive approaches first and then work our way towards the others if we need them.
Yeah. You mentioned magnesium, and that was really interesting what you were pointing out, how beneficial and how needed it is in the body. What people probably don't realize is anytime you get under stress, you're using magnesium. It's in 300 different bodily reactions. And anytime you get under stress, your body's releasing this magnesium to generate energy for communication, as well as to deal with different things that are going on, like making the neurotransmitters, controlling how the cells function. But when you get under stress, you start to use up that magnesium. If you're not replacing it, then you can get into trouble. And that's where you start to get symptoms, which are just warning signs, like I mentioned, like twitching of the eye, eye strain, or cramps, where you wake up with Charlie horses in the middle of the night. Those type of things are warning signs that, hey, you need to increase your magnesium intake. And if you do so, you'll see things like restless leg syndrome and muscle cramps and Charlie horses and those kind of things. They just go away. They stop. You don't have to fool with them anymore once you increase your magnesium intake.
And the other thing on top of that stress piece is not only you depleting magnesium, if it's a chronic stressor, you're squashing your serotonin levels. You're squashing all of your other anabolic builders, such as testosterone and so forth, because of those elevated stress hormone levels, such as cortisols and their metabolites. And if we don't get ahead of that, which I have a question for you on this, if we don't get ahead of that chronic trigger or sources of stress, we are in that hamster wheel. And that's when we are looking for, okay, I need something, that's a little bit more invasive potentially to get us off of that when we're not treating the root of the stressors. So we've got to look at all those possible connections. That's why, I know you and I, we talk a lot about gathering data about our patients through various means. Testing is one of those ways, but we see a lot of that in our clinic, as I'm sure you do as well. When we measure these levels, it's very obvious to see those connections.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I wanted to point out, I mentioned if you go through that real basic kind of protocol with the digestive enzymes, the 5-HTP, good multivitamin, make sure you're getting plenty of magnesium, add the S-Bilardi. One thing that I think a lot of people don't do, we've talked about this before, is one of the first things that I would do if you have a warning sign, which is a symptom that something's not right, no different than if your engine light comes on in your car. You can either ignore it or you can realize, okay, I need to figure out what this is. But if you've got a symptom, I think one of the things you want to look at is your medications.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes, the drugs that you're taking can be triggering some of these warning signs that in typical fibromyalgia, a lot of times the medications that they're prescribed, whether that's Lyrica, gabapentin, antidepressant, sleep medications, whatever, they can create diffuse achy pain, fatigue, brain fog. And the patient doesn't realize that medication is what's causing some of their symptoms. One of the ones I see a lot is cholesterol medication that really causes a lot of gut issues, and I'm sure you do too. And then metformin. We got this huge, just seems like everyone is on metformin, and everyone's type 2 diabetic now. And people don't realize they start taking metformin, and within a few weeks, a lot of times they start getting a lot of gut issues, and they don't make that connection. So what I want to, encourage everybody to do is look at your prescription medication. Not telling you to stop them by any means. There's a time, there's a place for them, but just make sure that some of the symptoms maybe that haven't been explained to you, or you're not really sure why you have them, look at your medications, look at the potential side effects, and then discuss that with your practitioner and see if there are other options. And obviously, if you can do a more natural option, that's what you want to try to do.
Well said. No, that's common sense. And I think that's very well said. Now, I've got a burning question about, I keep thinking of all these questions as we go, but, first of all, what are your best, on the topic of stress, what are your best stress reduction techniques that you apply, possibly personally, but more importantly to your patients?
I think first, John, is realizing that there is a connection. At first, being aware. I think so many people, unfortunately, just kind of show up every day, wake up in the morning, and then whatever comes along during the day, they respond to it. They're just always at the beck and call of stress. They're stress eaters. They just, they just gobble it up. So I think the first thing is realizing you have a choice. Now, it's not easy. But the first thing is to realize you have a choice how you're going to respond to stress. And no different than building muscle and creating, learning a new language, or whatever it is you're trying to increase your knowledge of and become an expert at, or at least become very good at, is managing your stress. And I think the place to start is carving out time every day. I call it my hour of power. It could be half an hour, but an hour of power where that's what that's what you're doing, is this quiet time where you meditate. That doesn't have to be anything, doesn't have to be anything fancy or crazy, just taking deep breaths and getting in tune with your body, prayer, if you're religious, and that's another way to really just calm everything down, reading positive, nurturing material, whether that's Wayne Dyer or Zig Ziglar or Joyce Myers, Joel Osteen, whomever. When you read that material, it feeds your soul. And then I think just exercise, getting some exercise on a daily basis. And that can be as simple as starting a walking program where you start out walking 10 minutes a day and you build up to 45 minutes or an hour a day. And, when people hear that are sedentary, the first thing they say, oh, I can't do that. But it's something that you do gradually. It's one step at a time. Slowly, before you know it, you build this habit over a 23 day period. And then you realize after 23 days that, you know what, I feel better doing these things. I want to keep it up. But I think you start the day looking at the day and knowing you're going to get under stress, but taking the time to kind of get yourself prepped for it so that when you encounter it, you can take a step back, take a deep breath, and decide, is it really worth having a blow up over someone cutting you off in traffic? And, you may flip them the bird or whatever you do. Hopefully you don't do that. But they've already left. They've already driven away. They don't even acknowledge you. But a lot of people, for an hour later, they're still upset. They come home. They come home. You kick the dog or kick the cat from a bad day that developed. Just let it go. Let it go. As my one of my mentors, Wayne Dyer, used to say, I can choose peace over this. And I think that serves people really well. You don't have to be right. You don't have to get in an argument. You don't have to succumb to someone else's stress that they're sharing. You can sidestep that and realize you don't even have to deal with it. Just move on.
Beautifully said. One of my quotes that we use a lot with our patients, it's about progress, not perfection. So as you said, one step, keep going. If you get distracted or fall off course, don't sweat it, let it go, move right on. But yeah, well said. All right, I remembered what my other big burning question is for you. Now, again, to tie in the IBS and the fibro connection, we can't have a conversation unless we talk about food. What's going on? What common threads do you see, Rodger, with the fibro IBS connection in terms of maybe there's certain foods that can be triggering and also maybe some that could be healing?
Well, I think food allergies are the great masqueraders. So food allergies can cause any symptom you can think of, whether that's brain fog, anxiety, depression, bloating, gas, indigestion, loose bowel movements. They can create all those things, inflammation and pain. So I think especially if you have a chronic illness like irritable bowel syndrome, where you're similar to fibromyalgia, they tell you, oh yeah, you have irritable bowel. Here's Bentyl or here's Miralax or whatever, and you just kind of have to live with it. Just giving you the name irritable bowel doesn't tell you anything.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing with fibro; it's just a name. So I think what you want to do is look at, okay, why am I getting these symptoms? What is it that I'm doing? And really the place to start is thinking every time I eat, the outside world is coming inside me. And every time I eat something, it can be nutritious or it can be deleterious. It can be a problem. Doesn't matter how clean you're eating, there are going to be toxins on there. There's going to be chemicals on there that have to be dealt with. And also you run the risk of having reactions to these foods. So I think that getting food allergy testing, ideally an ELISA test or an ALCAT test that's measuring delayed sensitivity, like IgG 1 through 4 reactions, which could take up to 72 hours later. I think getting food allergy testing is important for anyone that has a chronic illness, whether that's irritable bowel or fibromyalgia or Alzheimer's or an autoimmune disease, because one thing we do every day, most of us every day, is we eat foods, and there are repercussions from that biochemical process. The physiology can become compromised, and then you start if you're not careful, every time you eat, if you're having an allergic reaction, it can set off whether that's irritable bowel symptoms or chronic pain. It can be multiple symptoms are triggered.
Do you see any foods in particular that are healing? Again, I'm sure there's going to be cross reactivities to all sorts of foods that, even the healthy foods can be problematic at times.
Yeah. Now you mentioned more, want me to be a little more specifically what foods I see probably are problematic, right? And that's grains, without a doubt.
Yeah.
And people hate to hear that because they're so sick of hearing about being gluten free. I don't suggest to my patients that they all come off gluten, but I test all my patients because I know that's something I don't want to miss. But I think across the board that most people with a chronic health issue will find that if they come off gluten, that they oftentimes do better. Nightshades, tomatoes, potatoes, peppers, tobacco, eggplant. These have solenoids in them, solenoafoids. I can never pronounce the chemical in there. I always write about it, but I never talk about it, so I don't pronounce it right. But for some people, when they eat these nightshades, that chemical in there lodges in their joints and sets off arthritic-like pain. So I find that could be a problem. Corn, which is in everything, I think can be troublesome for some people. And then for some people, definitely dairy. Dairy is another big one because it's a mucus producer. Foods that I think are, for most people, can tolerate. I think most people can tolerate whole grain rice, even though it has, as you know, has a little bit of gluten in it. So some people like our friend Peter Osborne, Dr. Osborne would say no rice at all, because he's so militant. But for some people, you've got to be, you got to be very vigilant about cleaning up your diet. But I think most people can have wild rice. Most plant-based foods, if they're are fine. Where you get into more trouble with food allergies or more of the protein foods, dairy and animal products and nuts. But trial and error, trial and error is the way you find out, do you have a potential problem with a food?
Yeah. And just to clarify, a sensitivity is very different than an allergy. We're talking about sensitivities right now. So, if you've ever had allergy testing, it's very important. But also, many patients, when they first come to us, they haven't usually had sensitivity testing done. And so we've got to sometimes take it that next step. So listen, Dr. Rodger, anything else that we are missing that, on the IBS-Fibromyalgia connection that you think we need to learn about today?
Well, I think for me personally, when I'm lecturing about irritable bowel, I encourage people not to make it complicated. Start with the basics. People have shared some real basic things about cleaning up your diet. We've talked about taking a digestive enzyme. Probably we added something new that many of you didn't know about, which is the 5-HTP and the multivitamin to make serotonin. I'm sure other people have talked about constipation and magnesium being important. But I think, first of all, you want to start there, keep it simple before you start looking at mast cell and histamine dominance and SIBO and yeast overgrowth and leaky gut. Yes, can those all be playing a part of irritable bowel? They can, but I find that doing these other initial steps a lot of times will dramatically improve things. And then if you're not made the progress you need to, then do some testing. Work with your functional medicine practitioner, your healthcare practitioner, and get tested for food allergy or food sensitivities. Get tested if he or she thinks that you have SIBO, which if you have a lot of nausea and a lot of distension and bloating and gas, then suspect SIBO. But start off simple, the simple things you can do, and then go to some of these more I think kind of stressful and money investing type of approaches where you're going to have to spend some money.
More intense, sure.
Right. Yeah.
And what's an approximate time frame for that type of eating plan? The enzymes as well. What are you thinking is an effective amount of time before you need to look at those tests?
Well, I see my patients who do the protocols that I mentioned earlier. Within 2 weeks, their irritable bowel either goes away. Now I know that's going to blow people away because you've got a lot of people who have had irritable bowel for years and not found any kind of solution for it. But But speaking from doing this 20 years, I find that the majority of them within 2 weeks, it's dramatically improved or goes away and never comes back. Having said that, I think you should give it a month, at least a month. If you've been diagnosed with irritable bowel C, irritable bowel constipation, if you start taking a digestive enzyme and just getting enough magnesium, you're going to start to have a normal bowel movement. It could be that easy. For other people, though, there's going to be a percentage of people that they're going to need some additional help, some consults, or they're going to need some testing to figure out why, if they do these basic things, they're still not better. But I wouldn't start with those. I would start and keep it simple first.
Yeah, well, this is wonderful. Thank you for the plethora of insights and wisdom based on 20 years of practice. That's incredible. This has all been incredibly helpful to everyone listening today. And if anyone wants to learn more about you online and find you online to learn more, where can they find you?
Well, thanks, John. So there's two different websites. One is fibromyalgia based, and it's yourfibrodoctor.com. Obviously, it's all really focused on fibromyalgia, and I've specialized that in 23 years now, I think. But the other site, which is a more functional medicine oriented to other conditions like irritable bowel and thyroid and some of these other things, mold issues. I'm starting to work with a lot of mold patients. Is at superhealthyhuman.com. Free resources at both places, free reports, videos, blogs, podcasts. Go crazy, enjoy it, whatever you want to do. It's all there and it's free.
That's amazing. Thank you. And thank you for all the work that you're going to continue to do. This is, you are a leader in this industry and many others. So great to have you on, Dr. Rodger. And I look forward to our next conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Dempster. This is an important topic. I think that is going to be a real game changer for a lot of people that have battled this condition for a number of years and just really didn't have access to these resources that you're sharing. So thank you. Thank you for sharing them.
Appreciate it. Well, listen, take care of yourself and we'll see you soon.